Hello and welcome. My name is James Pawelski. I'm Professor of Practice and Director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Humanities and Human Flourishing Project explores connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being. As a part of this exploration, we brought in groups of scholars across 8 different disciplines in the arts and humanities, including my own discipline of philosophy, to discuss connections between these disciplines and the conceptualization and the cultivation of well-being. Each of these groups was led by a disciplinary chair who helped us to bring together a diverse group of scholars and then edited the volume of essays that these scholars wrote together. So I'm pleased to have joining me now Jim English, who is the John Welsh Centennial Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and was the disciplinary chair for the Literary Studies group. So Jim, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here, James.
So I wonder, Jim, if we could start on a personal note. Can you tell us a story of a time when your engagement with literature or the study of literature was beneficial for your well-being?
Well, what comes to mind for me really is the struggle that I had as a student coming out of high school and through college in finding something that I could commit to for a lifetime, something to do. I was a pretty able student. I was good at school, and I had been very much a mathematician, a kind of math and computer guy in high school, but I kind of got not exactly burned out on that, but bored with what I took to be the kind of directions it might lead me. I didn't want to be programming or, sort of writing code or doing mathematical problem sets for the rest of my life. It didn't feel morally or ethically important enough, the kinds of work I saw in that direction. And so I kind of looked around at other disciplines, and I took economics classes for a while. I moved to the sciences, and it was really very late in my college experience as a junior in college that I started in a serious way looking at literature. And the teacher I had then was teaching me creative writing. I came through the creative writing route, which has now become very common for undergraduate English majors. It's the most common concentration within the English major nationally and here at Penn, creative writing. But at that time, it was a kind of a small piece of the discipline. But it was my creative writing teacher, Robert Stone, who impressed me as someone whose life had the kind of seriousness I was looking for, the kind of moral integrity and intensity. And so I turned to literature at that point as something that was deep, that was profound, that I could sink all of my efforts and energies into for at least a bunch of years, which is probably about as far ahead as I could think at that time. And I wouldn't feel that I was wasting my time. So I think that really is for me. I mean, there are lots of moments where I've read something that struck me powerfully and made a difference. I've been a reader all my life, but that moment of turning, I've never regretted it. I've never felt that, in fact, I should have done something else, or that literature wasn't worth a lifetime of hard effort. I think that it really is.
That's really powerful, Jim. At that time in your life, it was really formative. It helped you to establish your identity, which is, of course, is an ongoing process, but really put you on a path that was a great fit for you, it sounds like. So, Jim, can you tell me what it was about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project that interested you and made you want to become involved with it?
Well, as you know, James, I was initially somewhat resistant to the idea of getting heavily involved in it. And I thought that the gap between the assumptions and practices and possibly the end goals of positive psychology and the Human Flourishing Project the gap between that and what goes on in literary studies and what we care about was too wide, and that it wasn't a very plausible collaboration. But that implausibility and that sense that this is a little uncomfortable for us and might be uncomfortable for you as well, then began to kind of attract me and make me think this could be an interesting stretch. And I've always been drawn to interesting stretches. The work that I do personally in literary studies puts me as something of an outlier, something of a kind of interdisciplinary oddity, because I work a lot with sociologists, I've worked with economists. I'm interested in the way that the literary marketplace operates, both symbolically and financially. And so these kinds of concerns aren't absent from literary studies, but they're kind of on the fringes. So I like that kind of a challenge, to see what's possible in crossing over from one discipline to meet up with another. And this has been very, very interesting from that standpoint. It's been because it's not only interdisciplinary across and around the humanities and the arts, but also has had us in conversation with social scientists. And we have tried in the literary group to do some reading and some at least initial sort of introductory study of the work that's been done in positive psychology in well-being and flourishing.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm really glad that you were up for that kind of potential discomfort and going beyond what is just kind of the standard expectation.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot of what makes this project so interesting for all of us, because we all are being stretched and having these conversations, and it helps us to articulate where we're coming from, to test our assumptions, to have conversations with other people who are quite intelligent and yet disagree with us. And so how can that possibly be, right? And kind of share these, or compare these perspectives in the world.
It's been helpful to me to come to recognize that you and the people who've worked for some years on the projects of human flourishing and well-being studies have not settled on conclusions. You're not. There's not a doctrine that's set and that you're trying to extend or have us buy into. It doesn't work that way. What you are involved in is a quest of research and intellectual discovery, and that's what we're involved in too. And so then the question is, well, can we discover anything together, or can we learn from each other's paths of exploration? And I think, of course, we can.
I think that's really well said, Jim. A lot of times people think about flourishing as a kind of destination, or, magazine editors want 3, infallible ways.
What's the recipe?
Right,
Yeah.
what's the recipe? Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And to my mind, perhaps ironically, if there were a recipe, a lot of it would be precisely the kind of quest that we're on, right? It's a questing, it's a learning, it's an interacting, an ongoing process.
It would be tear up the recipes, it would be like the first step in the recipe. It's that kind of a paradox that you get into. It's not, there isn't really a self-help, a simple self-help task list. It's rather a kind of a commitment to a life of struggle. And this has been another, I think for me, another really helpful point of convergence and mutual understanding as we've tried to work out our different understandings of the dynamic between negativity and positivity. In literary studies, if a text offers an easy, inevitable, happy ending, it's probably not of much interest to professors. It's not the kind of work that we probably want to teach our students. We generally have valued much more highly works that, if they arrive at some point of more or less happy or positive resolution, do so only through an arduous and uncertain struggle, and leave at the end room for doubt or hesitation as to where we really have arrived. That's the kind of literature that matters and we want to matter to our students. So, but this also seems to be the case with the way other disciplines, including social sciences, tend to approach positivity. It's not simply joyous happiness. After all, people can be happy at the misfortune of others. People can be happy looking at pain and suffering. That's okay, a kind of a dysfunction. Nevertheless, the point is that happiness in and of itself is not what we're after, and we don't try to offer our students books to read that will make them happy in that kind of a simplistic sense. We want to offer them books that will help to give them the resources, the tools for better understanding themselves and their lives, and for making progress towards something like a fulfilling life, beyond the classroom and beyond their undergraduate years. So there's a process of working through, and working through not meaning that you then simply arrive at the other side and then can say, finally, now I'm in the happy zone. It's not that. It's the process itself that's always going on. So that seems to me something where there's agreement across the disciplines, and then then the questions are about, well, how exactly do you try to do that in your own discipline? So how do we work with our students? What kinds of scholarly work do we do and show to each other in order to have a better grasp of these matters?
I think that's very well said, Jim. From my own perspective as a philosopher who's been working in the field of positive psychology for nearly 20 years now, I was fascinated to see how the field was developing and, in fact, helping to lead that development. But I also thought there were things missing. Because there weren't more people like me, that is to say, more people from the arts and humanities involved in a strategic way in these kinds of conversations. And so that's a reason why I came to your office and wanted to start this dialogue, to broaden out this conversation. Because human flourishing and well-being are such important topics that you can't just have no one approach is going to be what you need. And so I've really appreciated the perspectives, the kind of the thoughts about the process from literary studies that you and your colleagues have brought. And I want to turn to this, or I want to maybe dig a little bit more deeply into this question of how one processes, right? And so I think that from a positive psychology standpoint, kind of an easy way of misunderstanding the field would be to say it's about smiley faces and happy endings and anything, right? And to be fair, positive psychology has no problem at all celebrating moments of connection or gratitude, resolutions, right? And these are things that I think, from our perspective, as human beings, we all too often glide right past because we're kind of like, well, what's next on my to-do list, or what else might go wrong, right? And so I think maybe a way of putting the positive psychology perspective is it's not about happy endings, but in part it's about happy or fulfilling moments in that process and being able to tarry a bit in those moments, understanding that they can be valuable in their own right, and also we can learn a lot from those kinds of experiences, but not thinking that, those are the only kinds of experiences that we're going to encounter. So there are plenty of times when we're going to encounter adversity, and if we think that the thing to do is to shy away from adversity, to pretend it doesn't exist, that's not healthy either.
No, but I think I hear what you're saying. I think that we want to be cautious around the notion of sort of intermittent moments of happiness, and which still can suggest a separation of the happy or the positive from the sad or the negative. And I feel like what I've learned from working on this project and listening to others in other disciplines as well is that one shouldn't separate these things. One should allow for them to be imbricated and to kind of work together, so that if you are damaged, shamed, sad, depressed, being able to share that with someone else, finding a way to express that and a person to express it to who can express it back to you, or doing that even in terms of a character in literature, that sense of reciprocal sadness can in itself be a positive thing. It can be very, very helpful. And it's not because it turns it into happiness. It doesn't do that. But it makes it into part of this process of learning and self-learning and moving forward that we've been talking about.
And part of a deep connection between people, right? And an understanding that we're not alone. We're not somehow odd and an outlier in the human condition. That makes total sense to me. And I think from my side, I would say also it's important to be able to share moments of success or triumph or making, you worked really hard and things worked out. And I think oftentimes we're reluctant to share either one of those kinds of stories, right? We don't want to let people know our vulnerabilities, ways in which we may be damaged or depressed. We also don't want to let people know about when things went well or about our sense of meaning and what we're most fundamentally about in our lives, in part because we don't want to put people off. We don't want to be subject to ridicule, right? So it feels to me like there are kind of two ends of that.
But that's also what I think literature and other arts can do, but maybe especially literature and perhaps cinema and theater, other narrative arts, is that by saying, this work really, really, really moves me, it's my favorite work, to you, and having you say me too, we're then actually sharing something that's about ourselves, and yet we don't have to just come up to each other and start, biographing at each other. And so I think that literature often is a way to connect with other people, and we tend to think about the literary experience as a relation between the work and the individual, but really it's more often than not involves other individuals as well. It's a sense of being part of some kind of a collectivity or connecting to some person or handful of people around you that you didn't know before you had a connection to. Book clubs are really important. Libraries do this. They bring people together who have a shared interest in reading certain kinds of texts. Even online platforms like Goodreads or Library Thing, where people end up with sets of friends who what they have in common is a particular kind of enthusiasm for particular sets of books. All of those, I think, are really important for literature, and they are something that we cultivate in our teaching in our classrooms.
That's so important, Jim, because we oftentimes think of reading as this solitary activity. It's just one person in the book, or the e-reader or whatever at this point.
Yeah.
But understanding it in that community and community building way. So, Jim, I want to ask you about pedagogy and about the classroom. When you think about the literary studies classroom and your own work as a classroom instructor, how does these questions about human flourishing and well-being, what influence do they have in that context?
It's so multidimensional when you think about the different ways that we interact with our students and that we try to support them. The ways that we try to teach them to read interpretively and critically in the important or classic works of literature might be a minor part of what we do in the classroom, which often I think has. I think that the most positive things that we do for students, or for some students, is listening to them, allowing them to find that they have a voice, that they can talk about serious things, and they can do it and be taken seriously. This goes back to where we began, where I say, I think that literature really is about the most important things. It doesn't stop short of the the values and the concerns that are the bedrock of human flourishing. And so for students to be able to vocalize that in front of others and to be respected for what they say, that in itself, even if what they're saying is wrong, or if what we're trying to teach them goes off at some other angle from that, I think we're still having very good, very beneficial effects on our students there. I also think that as readers of students' writing, which is something that other disciplines do as well, but that we really do in English. We spend a lot of time, we complain about it a lot, oh my God, I've got this stack of papers I have to read, because it is kind of hard work, and it's not always the kind of reading you'd like to be doing, on a Sunday night. But nevertheless, we spend time and care reading our students' work, and we tell them, we think you could do this differently, we would suggest doing this, and we're responding in it. And so now they have a reader. They have somebody who's actually reading them seriously, and it's not just spell this word differently or, insert a comma here. That's not the kind of commentary we give. That, sure. But also, I wonder whether you've really thought about this hard enough. I wonder whether you would defend this particular way of articulating, this character's problem. I would tend to see it this way, and we have that kind of a dialogue about their writing. When we write, all of us feel vulnerable, we feel exposed, and so having someone seriously read you and tell you what they think seriously about what you've written, that's quite an intimate kind of a dynamic. And we do that. I think that doing that well, and many English teachers do that well, I think is can be a huge boost for students.
So Jim, my final question for you is about the future. When you think about the work of the Literary Studies group in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project,
Yeah.
and you think about the volume that you've put together, what do you hope for? What do you hope might change about perhaps the way that the discipline is going?
Well, as I've become more interested in and invested in these questions, and recognizing that they are not questions that have been widely taken up in a kind of explicit way in the discipline of literary studies, it seems to me what would be great to come out of the work that we've done, myself and Heather Love, in putting this group of people together and this volume together, would be that each of the kind of subfields or areas of work that the people contributing to the volume comes from and speaks to, becomes interested in the piece of work that they've done. That is to say, I don't see this as having one monolithic statement to offer or direction to point to for all of literary studies. Rather, what we have is we have someone who works in critical race studies and the relationship between race and climate change and ecological justice. That's one area of work within literary studies. Her contribution, Sonia Postmentier's contribution to the volume, might prompt further work in that area along the lines that she offers as a kind of model. And so likewise, Janet Lyons, who's a leading figure in disability studies. Janet has contributed a lovely essay on disability studies and flourishing, and on the teaching of disability studies and how that can contribute to the flourishing of students and the flourishing of others when students move on into a wider social world. So I would love to see the work that she does in the volume prompt other scholars in disability studies to pursue that line, and so on. So we could go through. So what I'd like to see is that this volume kind of seeds in a number of new directions of research. We feel very pleased with the caliber of the people who have contributed to the volume, and with the the seriousness with which their work is taken by others in the discipline. And so I think there's a real possibility that this will send out some sort of vectors of new and interesting work and reflection in the discipline.
So Jim, thank you so much for being with us today for this conversation, and thanks for the tremendous work you've done as the disciplinary chair.
Thank you. Thank you for pulling me into the to the project in the first place.
And thank you for having joined us as well as we spoke with Jim English on connections between human flourishing and literary studies. And we hope that you continue to join us as we carry on more of these conversations, exploring connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being.